Last year, we missed the much vaunted upper middle income status by just a few dozen dollars. So near, yet so far. This is very much also the story of the Philippines' economic development. From one of the richest countries in the region in the 50s and 60s, the Philippines is now a relative laggard. Per capita income has been growing in recent years, but nowhere as close. But nowhere as fast as in neighboring countries, particularly in China, Vietnam, and earlier in Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. Not to mention even Indonesia and Thailand. What explains the lack of inclusive development in the Philippines? Why is growth so concentrated among few families? A lot of experts point out at the relative lack or dearth of manufacturing in the Philippines. But why don't we have a strong manufacturing sector? That in itself is an important question. Don't we have industrial policy? What is our history of industrial policy or lack thereof? Why hasn't the Philippines managed to develop global industries as in neighboring Taiwan, South Korea, or Japan, not to mention increasingly even Vietnam? In order to understand that, we have a special guest, an economic historian who has been looking at the roots of the Philippines' economic maldevelopment and why industrial policy was never a cornerstone of our economic strategy. We'll also explore what is the way forward for the Philippines in the 21st century. Can we have a 21st century industrial policy so that the Philippines can finally become a manufacturing power like much of our peers? Prof. Claudio, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, pleasure. Of course, you're here at the perfect time. So much happening in the Philippines, in the United States, where you're based at UC Berkeley. Later on, I want to talk about, of course, a little bit of the situation about the U.S., the whole Elon Trump thing, the whole university Trump dynamics. There's a lot to discuss.
Right.
But, the reason why I was really looking forward to having you on this show, Fars, is I wanted to talk about this more longevity. It's kind of long-term analysis of why the Philippines is where it is today, which is this exceptional situation of high economic growth, high dynamism, but very much manufacturing free, right? And this is a kind of a puzzle that many people have different explanation for. And you have an upcoming book. Maybe by the time this show is out, the book is, God willing, out. Whereby you
it's out in November, so probably
exactly.
not. Okay.
No. So later this year, your book is going to come out. And in your book, I saw already the manuscript, right? It's one draft of it. You try to provide us, at least, you fill in some of the gaps. Kasi most of the analysis nakita ko is more contemporary, post-World War II, or even post-Cold War, or even 21st century, right? So what does your research do? What kind of gaps precisely it fills up? And how does it inform our understanding? Bakit Philippines' development trajectory has been so different from everyone else, and not to mention development philosophy at the policy-making level?
Right. So I'm really building on the work of a group of economists who in the 1990s offended the central bank, and the central bank got so offended by them that the central bank's allies called them jukebox economists. And why did they offend the central bank? Because this group of economists, largely led by Raul Fabella, who is the expert on currency policy, wanted to depreciate the peso. And he felt that if you depreciate the peso, especially during the time of the build-up towards the Asian financial crisis, you would prevent the entry of hot money into the Philippines, but also you would give a boost to our export sector. They did that again during the pandemic. So Mr. Calixto Chicamco, he said it again. He was also part of the Jukebox Economics group. He said, depreciate the peso to give the Philippines fiscal space during the pandemic. And again, nobody listened to them. And the argument there is quite simple. The peso is really overpriced. We think of the peso as pabagsak na pabagsak. But if you compare the peso to, say, Vietnam, the currency of Vietnam, or the currency of Korea, the peso over the past 50 years is actually flat. It hasn't really depreciated relative to the more developmental economies. And the argument of the jukebox economists is that we should really have a realistic price for the peso to have greater exportation in the Philippines and to encourage a diversification of the manufacturing sector towards a manufacturing sector that doesn't only look inward, but also looks outwards and brings in foreign currency to the Philippines that then shields us from global economic crisis. So that's the work they've done. What I've essentially done, because I'm not an economist, I'm an economic historian, is I've asked the question, why has that been so difficult to depreciate the peso? And that is
an encourage our exports, encourage our industries.
Yeah, and that's a macroeconomic question, but that is a question for an intellectual historian because that is essentially a question about the history of ideas. How did it come about that both the left, right, the far left, the Makabayan bloc, and the conservative central bank, they believe that the peso should not depreciate significantly, right? So that's a kind of left-right consensus. And it was a puzzle that I sought to uncover in my forthcoming book.
So one
which
is
called-
populist, one is prudential.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's what I try to do, and I begin the story at the turn of the century in 1902 when the United States imposed the strong peso on us. So I think it's a colonial legacy that we've never really shaken off as a country.
I want to build on this because just for folks to appreciate where you're coming from, the argument basically is that one reason we have not developed strong manufacturing is because our currency policy does not encourage it, right? So we'll go to this more later when we discuss Trump, because one of the accusations of Trump against China or even allies like Japan and Germany is that they manipulate their currency to make their exports more cheaper and most competitive, right?
Yeah.
So that's why the whole tariff and everything is
yeah.
coming in. What we're trying to understand in the case of the Philippines is that actually we are also paying the price for the legacy of a certain economic policy, economic philosophy that the Americans impose on us. Can we go back to that? So what happened during American colonization in the Philippines in terms of imposition of certain economic philosophy? And why is it so sticky?
Yeah.
100
oh
years
my
ang
God,
pinag-usapan
Richard.
natin.
Yeah. So
Bakit ang tagal?
it took me 180 pages to answer this question, but I'll try to condense it here. So it really begins, as I said, in 1902. 1902 was when the Philippines was the end of the Philippine-American War, so formally a colony now of the United States. And the question was what to do with the money of the Philippines. The United States at this time was run by Republicans, and the commitment of the Republicans during that time was to the gold standard. And the gold standard is a highly austere standard for currency, meaning the amount of money that's circulating has to correspond with an equivalent amount of money in gold. So that prevents spikes in the money supply, but and that prevents inflation, but that also prevents rapid growth of the economy, because to stimulate the economy you have to throw money into the system effectively, right? So it was a system of austerity that they implemented in the United States to the chagrin of the southern farmers who wanted more subsidies, right? They were the constituency of the Democrats. And when they came into the Philippines, they said, we need to be consistent. If we implement an austere currency policy in the United States, we need to implement it in the Philippines. So what they did was they implemented a gold exchange standard. At dito nanggaling yung famed exchange of 2 pesos to $1. Now, many Filipinos, the average Filipino on the street, they think 2 pesos to $1. Those were the halcyon days when the Philippine economy was so strong. That's absolutely not true. That was an external imposition. And in fact, prior to that, there were years of export growth in the Philippines, precisely because, in the words of economists from the 1990s who studied this, there was a secular depreciation of the peso during the time of Jose Rizal. So I hate to overstate the power of the Philippine peso, but the weak Philippine peso actually contributed to the growth of Filipino nationalism. Why? Because the export growth that the depreciating Philippine peso encouraged allowed for the growth of inquilino families like the Mercado Rizal family, and allowed them to study in Spain. So in many ways, we owe our nationalism to a cheap peso.
So,
and the United States decided, we don't want any of that.
So cheap peso created an ilustrado class. An
Yeah.
export-oriented, mercantilist even, Filipino class, which eventually became the locomotive for national liberation.
So I don't want to overstate it. It's one factor, right? But it is a factor. And we need to remember that the cheap peso is core to our national identity. Except we've forgotten it because the Americans introduced the strong peso, right? And it's very fascinating because hindi alam ng mga Pilipino to, we are the only peso that is denominated with a P. Right? All other pesos are actually the S, the dollar sign, because that's actually not an S. Those are 2 P's, right? The S sign is actually 2 P's. So every peso you see, like the Mexican peso, right? That's actually denominated as the S, which corresponds to the dollar. So from the inception pa lang of our new American Philippine peso, it was supposed to be exceptional, right? And there is something exceptional about the history of the peso. It's exceptionally austere.
And very much a derivative of America's sense of exceptionalism, which we'll discuss more. Again, I want to go back to this. One of the things I found fascinating with your book is you discuss also this kind of an Orientalist trope, which is the idea is that pag macho ka talaga, you're not going to... Because the idea is that the Western civilization always tried to justify their colonization by saying this decadent Oriental people, right? You give them money, there's going to be corruption. In fact, in the literature, you find this... studies saying that the time the Americans put money into Philippine National Bank, the next thing you know, this decadent Orientals ruined it. You push back against that. But you say that actually there was also a conscious effort by the Filipino technocrats to push back against that Orientalist trope.
Yeah.
But it ended up self-destructing.
Yeah. So the title of my book is The Profligate Colonial, and that is a metaphor for the person in the colonies who is too irresponsible and in the eyes of imperialists too effeminate to spend. So the rhetoric they go like, these are like bad housewives who don't know how to save money. These are barbarians who spend too much. So we should restrain their funding through a very restrictive gold standard. So it has to be even more restrictive than the gold standard in the United States because these people are actually more barbaric than, say, the southern farmers that the Republicans were taking on. And the way Filipinos responded to that was very strange, actually. The way they said, okay,
Mas macho
you
pa
want to
kami sa
call
inyo.
us profligate? We're not going to be profligate. We're going to be extra macho.
Yeah.
So, for example, during the Great Depression, when the United States decided to depreciate the dollar, the response of the Filipinos was like, we're going to go off our dollar peg because the dollar is now a cheap currency. We're going to go back to gold because we're even more macho than them. And this idea that a cheap peso is effeminate, not masculine, it's a very consistent metaphor. So you see it in 1902. You see it in the 1920s with the near collapse of the Philippine National Bank. You see it being used by Central Bank Governor Miguel Cuaderno, who is one of the villains of my book. And then I was talking to the late Cayetano Paderanga, former NEDA secretary, and he said one of the reasons why the central bank did not agree with the jukebox economists, and he was one of the jukebox economists, was because the central bank thought it was effeminate. So it's like it's a metaphor that has lasted more than 100 years, Richard.
It's toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity applied to currency.
Exactly. I call it TNL economics. You know why that's relevant? Because in the 1990s, we had a different version of that.
Yeah.
Oh, you want globalization? We'll bring down our tariffs. We'll go zero tariffs. And we can compete. Next thing you know, we got decimated. Like the shoe industry in Marikina could not compete with the dumping from China and all. So you could see permutations of that over time. No? But I want to go back again to early 20th century because this was a period of state building. In fact, in lineages of Filipino strongmen, if you look at it, Manuel Quezon came closest to that. Some would say if there were no Second World War, he would have come before, let's say, Nero. He would have been the Filipino Nero or another strong. So he could have overseen the establishment.
Manuel Quezon is the Philippines, and the Philippines is Manuel Quezon.
Exactly,
That was his thing,
L'État-c'est-moi, I am the state, and build a developmental state, right? From what I understand, he had also some admiration for the Japanese model of developmental state. So it didn't happen. But nevertheless, there were efforts in early 20th century, even during the colonial period, to have some semblance of industrial policy. Can we discuss that? And what is industrial policy for the purpose of people who...
So industrial policy is essentially the state, in a sense, participating in industry, and at least the more extreme version of that is the state picking winners and saying, we're going to invest in you. Whereas the kind of neoliberal model is the opposite of that, the free market model, which is that the state just guarantees free competition and then people compete, right? And we have been very averse to a kind of very activist state in the Philippines. I mean, you talk about our neighbors, right? Vietnam is very activist these days. But Korea was also very activist. Japan was also very activist. So we're a kind of Asian exception. I mean, even Singapore or even Malaysia,
Taiwan,
they're pretty activist. And I think one of the reasons why we haven't been very activist historically is the growth. We never grew particular parts of the government that could have been key in industrial policy. So in Manuel Quezon's time, that was the National Economic Council, which eventually became NEDA, right? So we never really empowered NEDA. So another institution which could have been empowered to engage in industrial policy is the Department of... what's Marroas's department again? He's Mr. Palengke.
Trade and Industry.
Trade and Industry, sorry, mental block. Yeah, DTI. Of course, we've talked about this before in your podcast. In Japan, that was the MITI, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, which was extremely powerful. We've never had a really powerful DTI.
For the purpose of our audience, can you explain what did MITI do? Because this is the quintessential case of an activist bureaucracy helping national development. And interestingly, because again, there's always this argument that lawyers should not run the government because they're too rigid. But actually, in the case of the University of Tokyo, they provided the technocrats who oversaw a very flexible, dynamic, and proactive economic policy that made Japan the industrial powerhouse.
It's a bit of a cliche now, but the way people, if you were against, this had pejorative undertones if you didn't like what the Japanese were doing, but it had complementary undertones if you like. They called it Japan Inc., meaning the government and industry
were fused
together. And that was best exemplified by MITI because at MITI, you would have graduates from an imperial university,
Ministry
Todai
of
Law.
International Trade and Industry, yeah.
Coming into MITI, and then when they finished, they would have amakudai, which is like a post-retirement position. They would go into the big zaibatsu, like the board of Toyota, the board of Mitsubishi, and as a result, you'd have extreme coordination. Of course, in the eyes of Filipinos who are very walang korap, walang mahirap, this strikes of conflict of interest, rent-seeking, and corruption. But the funny thing about the developmental state is when it works, it's a developmental state. When it doesn't work, it's very easy to label it as corruption and rent-seeking. Rentier state. But this is the opposite of kind of the baseline impulse of Filipinos, which is, I think, a kind of neoliberal baseline impulse.
So where does it come from? Because one of my theories is that we also, because we were colonized by a libertarian America, we kind of just, because the Europeans are very dirigist, a very kind of a strong state, especially the French model, right? But I always felt ours was always this American libertarianism, you see in different surveys like Asia Barometer survey. Nung tinanong lahat ng taga-ASEAN, sa tingin niyo ba ang gobyerno dapat mag-intervene to create social justice, meaning progressive taxes? Philippines lang yung parang malayo sa lahat. So we're the most liberal, at the same time, we're the most libertarian liberal.
Libertarian,
so
neoliberal, anti-interventionist.
Exactly. So I can only understand that as a reflection of the fact that we had this peculiar combination of weak Spanish colonial legacy in terms of state building and this American aggressive libertarian, right? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes absolute sense to me, and that's what I'm trying to document, right? The very fact that the language of Americans is the same language we use until today is already an indicator. Actually, Richard, you find this funny. I was talking to the economic correspondent of the New York Times, and we were talking about economic attitudes of Filipinos, and I was describing all this to him, and he said one thing to me: "You guys are the Germany of Asia."
That was not a compliment.
That was not a compliment, but that means like extreme fiscal and monetary conservatism, right? I mean, you were talking in your previous episode with Professor Rai, for example, like in other countries, economic issues are, top of mind, right? But the economic issues that are top of mind, they change. Sometimes it's inflation, sometimes it's employment, sometimes it's salary. In the Philippines, it's always inflation, which makes us very German, because actually inflation, being extremely averse to inflation means you're extremely averse to aggressive monetary policy, which can push up inflation.
Actually, I would say we're more the Austrian school.
Oh yeah, Austrian school.
Actually, I would say more Austrian.
So it's fascinating because it is a kind of attitude that you see among everyday people, like extreme inflation aversion, and we're a very bizarre country in the sense that the economic indicators that we're tracking all the time, if you open the newspaper, it's the price of the peso and inflation, right? Whereas in the US, that's part of it, but the jobs report is equally as important, right? So there's a kind of baseline conservatism in terms of what economic indicators people are looking at. Now, lest I get misunderstood, these are important indicators, of course. What I've been arguing for, and I think you've been arguing for, is not to disregard these indicators, but to look at broader indicators of economic health, like inequality, alongside, of course, those indicators like inflation.
Thank you for juxtaposing it to contemporary debates that we'll go back to. But I want to go back to history again. Obviously, if we had a 4-hour podcast, we would have gone through your entire fantastic book. But one of the fascinating insights I get from your work in general, not only the book, but your interventions, is that after Manuel Quezon, the other strongman we got, literally, was Marcos Sr. And it's interesting because recently there was this piece on New Yorker which was looking at how America is looking less like Russian system, it's more like crony capitalism, and he used Marcos Sr. as a model.
Right.
But it goes back to what you said, like when developmentalism fails, it's crony capitalism. When it succeeds, it's developmental. What went wrong during the Marcos period? Because some would say the guy tried. The guy tried, and they put actually Jerry Sikat, a couple of other people who are blamed for supposed neoliberalization of the Philippines. But actually, a lot of them had ideas about industrial policy. So what went wrong? Because that was the second attempt, I would say, at bringing manufacturing to the Philippines.
Let me just say that term, crony capitalism, was first used in Time magazine to describe the Marcos administration. So that's a kind of Philippine contribution to global economic
discourse. In the wrong way.
Right? In many ways,
again,
Walden Bello is correct, because we've been tied to this idea of crony capitalism. We are the anti-developmental state. We are the developmental state that failed. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's such a high baseline economic conservatism in the Philippines, because the person who tried, the greatest secular depreciation of the peso occurred during the Marcos period, right? So the first big depreciation was during the time of Rizal. The second big one was during the
Right.
Marcos period. And we all know how the Marcos period ended. It ended with a severe economic crisis in 85, 86 that led to the People Power Revolution. And we were born during this era, so we were born during the worst economic crisis since the Japanese occupation. And so I think that crisis is now articulated with the economic policies of Marcos. And I think we need to be, we need to be very careful here. We can't endorse authoritarianism, but at the same time, and we have to acknowledge that many of Marcos's policies, because they were so corrupt, led to failure. But at the same time, I don't think we can throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there are a couple of things that Marcos did that I think we should revisit. Like, for example, a very strong NEDA. So you mentioned Jerry Sicat, right? Jerry Sicat was a very strong NEDA who would intervene in central bank policy debates. Now, for economic conservatives, they think that the central bank is like the Supreme Court. You can't say anything about what the central bank does, right? It should be purely run by bureaucrats. But that's really a myth. I think the government, well, maybe there are certain policies of the central bank that the government should not interfere with, but definitely I think NEDA should be able to debate the central bank, right? That's central bank independence is not being able to tell NEDA to shut up, right? And I think during Sicat's time, because you had a powerful Department of Finance under Virata and a very powerful NEDA under Sicat, there's a lot more coordination. And remember that the powerful NEDA is really just the culmination of this idea of a strong NEC, National Economic Council, that began with Quezon, right? So that kind of industrial policy that began there, there's a kind of through line there, but that really ended after Sicat, after that generation. So we don't really talk about the NEDA as a kind of powerful, the kind of same powerful player that it was during that time. Maybe these days finance is powerful, budget is powerful, but NEDA is no longer as powerful as it was.
But NEDA is supposed to be the think tank for your state economic policy.
Strategy,
Closest
planning.
to MITI, right? Which we haven't had. Now, I want to go back to the US, because one of the things I find interesting is that I've heard more about industrial policy at the heart of new liberal capitalism, right? I've dealt with conservative think tanks, I've dealt with progressive think tanks. They all talk about New Deal, or they talk about, there's this new notion of co-development. So, wow, it's fascinating. So, at the very heart of new liberal capital, which is the idea of, free market, privatization, so everyone's talking about so you have a Biden Democratic version, you also have a Trumpian version.
Exactly.
And that's where actually Trump, we can talk about him a bit more, but, Trump is coming from this notion since the 1980s that America is deindustrializing. And the numbers are proving him correct. Actually, US went from more than a quarter of global manufacturing to just over 10% today, right? And the share of manufacturing as a GDP has completely collapsed over the years. US is a quarter of global GDP, and yet like barely 9% of its exports. And Trump has a right instinct. This is the foundations of America. If you have weak manufacturing, your military will also eventually suffer, and you'll be dependent on foreigners, especially China. So everyone's talking industrial policy, but not here.
Exactly.
I'm like the only guy. This is like really anomalous. Is it because we're so macho? We're so macho that we don't need any policy. Our markets will just carry us through the day.
Grabe no, Richard, because if you think about it, it begs the question, how do we respond to the populist challenge? So in the United States, Trump was the populist challenge. He talked about the fact that middle America was being emptied out of its manufacturing jobs. And he said, we'll make America great again. And part of that was really to think about industrial policy again. The Democrats, they've had their failures, but they were smart enough to know that they were absolutely going to get clobbered by the Republicans if they didn't have a version of that. So what you got was Biden's CHIPS Act, for example. What you got was friendshoring under Biden. What you got was the Inflation Reduction Act of Biden. We don't get anything from
we're talking about trillions of dollars, just to be clear.
We don't get an equivalent from the Yellows or the Liberals here in the Philippines. They're still talking about strong institutions, anti-corruption, right? Kung walang corrupt, walang mahirap, or sa gobyernong tapat, angat buhay lahat. There was not an equivalent adjustment, and an adjustment was necessary. And I want to encourage people to read the work of a terrific scholar named Charmaine Ramos, and she said, one of the reasons why Duterte was so popular was because he engaged in the highest levels of social transfers of any other post-EDSA president. This was before the pandemic, of course. But that shows to you that there was a sense in the Duterte administration that you needed to jumpstart the economy and make it a lot more equal. And the way we responded to that, at least us progressives, was to go back to a version of walang korap, walang mahirap, which is sa gobyernong tapat, angat buhay lahat. And allow me to be a little bit more polemical here. Even the research has not changed. So my colleagues at the Ateneo School of Government, what are they studying? They're still studying whether or not dynasties lead to poverty. Yeah. They're still studying institutions. They're still studying Acemoglu and Robinson, right? The kind of, and if you go to Fully Book, Acemoglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail, that's still the 5th most sold book in Fully Book. And I think that's part of the problem because institutions matter, yes, but sometimes you get into a chicken and egg problem. The chicken and egg problem is why are institutions weak? And many times institutions are weak because there's not enough money to fund these institutions to strengthen them. It takes money to have strong institutions. How do you get money? A strong industrial policy.
Not to mention, there's a lot of pushback based on examples of successful post-colonial states like China. There are a couple of very top scholars from Johns Hopkins, among others, who said, well, actually, if you look at the history of the West, they were damn corrupt when they were going. Look at Gilded America, where they had the first burst of massive industrialization. It was not a bastion of good governance. If you look at every successful post-World War II industrialization example, South Korea, corruption through the roof. Like, look at the Devo family corruption scandal. Look at how corruption scandal brought down their version of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Park Geun-hye. Look at China. The corruption is all over the place.
Oh my God,
and yet, that's why, I mean, again, this is oxymoronic term. The idea is that there is efficient corruption in certain countries, and then there's this kind of decadent, destabilizing corruption. So it's not corruption per se that explains poverty. It's the debilitating version that we have in the Philippines, which is this consumer-driven, I don't know, money for the mistresses type, rather than the version of corruption in China or Korea that actually it's reappropriation of funds, but still goes to industries, still goes into productive sectors.
I really believe that the empirical value of kung walang korap, walang mahirap is close to nil. It's not true. Even sa gobyernong tapat, angat buhay lahat, it's just not empirically verifiable. Angat buhay lahat if there is an activist state na makamasa. So we should take anti-corruption as a given. Like, anti-corruption is important. It's morally important. We don't want corrupt leaders. And I don't want corrupt leaders. You don't want corrupt leaders. But it's not
given
enough. It should be taken as a given. Right? So what we should be looking for is a kind of synthesis of the kind of reformist anti-corruption, but also the kind of makamasa rhetoric of the populace. So somewhere in between walang korap, walang mahirap, and era para sa mahirap, right? Because it's not, kung walang korap, hindi necessarily walang mahirap eh. Kailan may makamasang presidente. And industrial policy can be talked about as something that is pro-masses.
Great jobs, great, training and all of that.
And just to talk about our neighbors, like, we think that Korea, every Filipino thinks that Korea got rich because they stopped being corrupt. No, Korea got rich because they invested in industry. The economist Ha Jun Chang says that, when he was growing up, there was this term, Korean time. And Korean time meant what it means here in the Philippines. The equivalent is Philippine time, like lagging late, 1 hour, 2 hours late. But when economic development happened, Korean time disappeared. So that's a very clear example of how the economic development precedes the development of institutions.
And new culture.
And new culture.
It's like people say, ganitong mga kasi patriotic sila. It's like, so how does that explain the fact that Korea was poorer than the Philippines up until 1960s? Korea has been around forever, right? China was a very poor country until recently. Vietnam was poorer than us until pandemic. But going back again to what you said a while ago, which is during Duterte, we saw a massive expansion in small-scale infrastructure, especially in Mindanao. So actually, there's a logical base to Mindanao support. I can go on forever, but I'll rather keep it there. And then there's also this idea of yung mga 4Ps. So if you look at the socio-economic related indices, tumaas talaga during Digong's time. Obviously, thanks to Pinoy's time savings.
Yes.
Right? Let's be clear about that.
We don't deny
that money didn't come out of nowhere. So tama naman si Pinoy na walang corruption. Pero you cannot just stop there. I mean, the political correct term I use for that is inutil liberalism, right? The liberalism, which is good in terms of saving you from corruption, saving you from tyranny, and then it stops there. when people want something more from that.
Yeah.
And you can see the desperation that even during Duterte's time, massive human rights violation, massive corruption, some would say, because may dumating pa rin sa mga tao, again, thanks to the savings during the Aquino administration, but also the activist policy of the state, meron talagang lingering, actually robust base of support, almost inelastic na 10 to 15%. So basically what you're saying is that the lesson we should learn from the past century is that, you have to tinker around with currency, with other important policies, because at the end of the day, to have legitimacy, right, for whatever political system you have to deliver socioeconomic goods, hindi lang political rights or civil liberties.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I put my cards on the table. I'm an old school social democrat in that sense. I believe that the state is our most effective means for social transfer in a highly unequal country. And that's why I think, we were talking about, during your earlier show, you were talking about why did BAM make it? Why did Kiko make it? And earlier, why did Risa make it? I think they were representing an alternative, but also there was a clear social protection message for all those candidates, like Kiko with agriculture, BAM with education, and Risa with healthcare. Right? For me, this should be the new face of opposition. It's not just that we're clean, we're going to deliver services. And I think that's working. Because also, if you look at the surveys, people are not looking for anti-corruption candidates. In 2020, that was not the top concern anymore. The top concern was kandidatong may magagawa. And I think an activist state is precisely that, a state na may magagawa. And a kandidato na may magagawa represents an activist state.
And I think this is where it's important na progressives provide an alternative. Kasi automatically activist state, strongman, therefore, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You're gonna go down the slippery slope, the rabbit hole. So what you're saying is that it's important to create a counter-narrative to kailangan natin ng diktadores, strongman kasi inutil yung Estado What is your conception of that? Because this is also relevant in the context of the U.S. Because at least in the U.S., Democrats under Biden tried to do something. And a lot of that is because of Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
Right? The populist base in the Democratic Party pushed really Democrats to embrace a more populist, activist state agenda. And that's why, people would say maybe Biden was the problem rather than the policies, right? Or namalas lang siya, nabutan siya ng inflationary
yes.
spike.
It was the pandemic,
But Democrats did much better than all other incumbent in G7 countries, like in Germany, in France, in UK, all the incumbents got completely wiped out. Democrats did not suffer as much, comparatively. Again, everything is comparable. But what I'm saying is that the U.S., our story starts with the U.S., right? And U.S. today, if you look at it, at least there are two versions of activist state. There's the Biden-Bernie version, at least, or whatever, or New Deal version. And then there's the Trumpian version, right? In the Philippines, what we're saying is that actually na-monopolize ng authoritarian populists, basically the Duterte camp, yung notion of a strong state, welfare state, protective state, law and order state. And what we're saying is that there's a vacuum of alternative.
Yeah, even we were just talking about the scholarship, right? The NEC, we associate it with authoritarians. Quezon,
exactly.
Marcos. And then, he didn't necessarily have a strong NEDA, but he had strong transfers. Duterte, I don't think this is the exclusive patrimony of authoritarian people. Social democracy is precisely that. There's a social element, and then there's a democratic element. So the social element is the strong activist state. The democratic element is the human rights, is the strong institutions, is the anti-corruption, is the representation. Those things can exist in tandem with each other, and we've seen it. We've seen it, of course, in the great social democratic states of Europe, but we've seen hints of it throughout the history of Southeast Asia as well.
Speaking of history again, as we mentioned earlier in this show, some are saying that the U.S. is looking more like Russia, right? Oligarchs and all. Some are saying, no, not necessarily that. U.S. will still remain a democracy, but it's looking more like Marcosian crony capitalism, right? Whereby you're still going to have elections, some level of competitiveness, but nevertheless, you have this brazen sorts of behavior that would have been unthinkable in the U.S. a long time ago. What is your read of that? Because, by early June, you're having the Elon Musk drama with Trump. You are from one of the top universities in the country. There's a lot of dynamics between the state and the universities. I know the situation is very sensitive. We see what's happening with Harvard and all, to the degree that you can. This is crazy, right?
Well, I have to preface with my remarks by saying that I am an administrator of a federal grant.
Give all the disclaimers you need. I don't want to put you in trouble.
That's the most important disclaimer I'll make. And I do want to acknowledge that as somebody who works in higher education, there's a lot of uncertainty as to where we're going. Having said that, I think the East Coast schools are more directly in the line of fire than us. But there's a lot of trepidation, especially I have a lot of graduate students who hear the news about, student visas being withheld
students,
or being withdrawn, and they're very afraid. So I don't know. In many ways, this is definitely unprecedented within my lifetime. I haven't seen this kind of tension between universities and the federal government in my lifetime. Definitely, I've only been in the United States for 6 years, but I've never seen anything like it as an observer.
Even in historical documents, right?
As a historian, as a participant, and just as a person living in the United States. So I have no idea, Richard.
But what about the systemic argument? The systemic argument that the U.S. political system is evolving into something else, right? Because, my mom the other day was watching House of Cards, and I said,
there's something quaint about it, right?
That era is over. You do crisis management over what? Now it's saturation. Past 24 hours, I'm keeping up. What is the latest between Elon and Trump? We're in a totally different world. I mean, again, I talk about America. The reason I wanted to connect the Philippines and America is to say that so many things happening here there's an American angle or legacy to it. But it's just weird that now there are Americans who are saying that the U.S. could look like crony capitalism a la Marcos Sr. What is your read of that as a historian?
Which is sort of the Marxist argument here, and I'm not a Marxist, but the Marxist argument would be...
Late capitalism,
would say
eating
something
democracy.
Like, what is the point of qualifying capitalism? Oligarchic capitalism, booty capitalism, crony capitalism, all forms of capitalism combined with some kind of liberal democracy create inequities, right? It is kind of fundamental to capitalism. It is not exceptional to let's say Philippine or American capitalism. I'm not necessarily that radical, but I do think we need to stop exceptionalizing the Philippines and saying it's an extraordinarily corrupt country compared to others. Because how do you measure corruption
even
anyway,
in the global ranking, we're kind of middle of the road.
And as Marco Garrido, the sociologist from Chicago is saying, is definitions of corruption are highly culturally specific. What's corrupt here may not be corrupt for other people. So, for example, we talked about Amakuna in Japan, that may be corrupt for others and may not be corrupt for others, right? And remember...
Or lobbying in the U.S., millions given to congressmen is corrupt in other countries, but in the U.S. it's a normal lobbying business, right?
And so what's the only measure for corruption in the Philippines? It's the Corruption Perceptions Index. And how the methodology for that is they ask businessmen and experts how corrupt is the country, and then they self-rate. In many ways, I think it's a kind of self-fulfilling phenomenon for the Philippines because we get told all the time in the media, by politicians,
self-orientalizing, I call it,
by academics that we're extraordinarily corrupt. So it shouldn't be surprising that in the Corruption Perception Index, we're on the high end, right? But this is not to deny corruption. This is just to say that we can't exceptionalize the Philippines and say, we're so much more corrupt than our neighbors, and that is why we are so much more. That's why we're so much poorer. That's making excuses for our policymakers.
Bad policies.
I think our policymakers have to decide that that Filipinos deserve something better than what they've gotten in the past, how many 100 years at least.
No, this is important. Again, this is where I think the contribution of sociologists like Walden Belli comes in, which is, yes, go and blame the trapos or corrupt because corruption is bad, but also blame those squeaky clean technocrats who are not technically corrupt, but had this macho policy, tariffs, baba natin, zero. And then you massacre a whole industry.
Yes, exactly.
Or Philippine peso, palakasin natin, massacre all export-oriented. Those guys probably should be even blamed more than corrupt, because corrupt politicians steal millions. Bad policy costs you trillions over time.
Exactly.
In terms of foregone economic productivity, right?
Yeah. And then, one of the things I realized in my book is that these guys, there's a classic explanation that these guys were bullied by the IMF. They were bullied by the World Bank into implementing neoliberalism. But these guys are highly educated people. And many times, the IMF person was some junior economist.
And they were
fresh out
the
of college,
PhD from Harvard.
And PhD from Harvard, PhD from Princeton. These guys can't tell them what, these World Bank people can't always tell these guys what to do. The conclusion here is that they're accountable. Right? There are no excuses here. They're accountable for these policy mistakes, and we have to hold them accountable by studying these institutions. So, for example, this entire idea of the central bank as completely independent, they're like the Supreme Court. We can't think about the central bank politically. Well, we know that actually every day we think about the Supreme Court politically.
Yeah, we debate them.
Yeah, we debate them.
Yeah.
So Supreme Court independence, everybody knows that's a kind of myth, right? We say it.
And just to be clear, in Supreme
society.
Court, actually, you get, you get legit luminaries end up there most of the time.
Yeah.
Central bank, any guy, there are people there who have no offense. Like, how do you end up in central bank? I know there are people who are in central bank who are just political appointees or something like that.
Yeah, there's an element to that as well. So I'm not saying that these people are not experts,
but they're not
I'm
saints.
saying they should be part of the democratic process, because what I've seen is that central bankers or people in the economy go like, well, we're an independent institution. You should treat us like the Supreme Court. Don't debate us. We're experts. You're not experts. And that essentially was kind of rhetoric that began in the 1950s when Miguel Cuaderno, the founder of the central bank, was really engaged in a highly undemocratic policy, saying, I'm not going to listen to anybody in the electorate.
He was a lawyer by training, right?
He was a lawyer by
not
training,
even a real economist.
He used the myth of central bank independence as a kind of cudgel to prevent him from having to respond to Congress, to the Senate, to labor unions, and to people. So there is a sense in which when these people talk about, this is our terrain, they should be mindful of the fact that there's a kind of underlying anti-democratic discourse there. And people should be wary of that, and they should push back and say, no, we want to be part of the conversation. Of course, you don't just, wade into the conversation without knowing anything. That's why, as a responsible citizen, we should be reading up about economics the way we read about politics, right? So nobody ever says like, he's not a political scientist. How come he's weighing in on politics? But when it comes to economics, suddenly the calculus changes, right?
Because the pretension is that this is physics. But last night I checked, even physics is questioned. The world is flat, apparently. The earth is flat. I want to end on this important note because U.S. Philippines, this is always the conversation. Nowadays, one of the things that is coming out, and in fairness, there's continuity from Biden to Trump and who knows what's next, which is the Philippines could be part of this kind of a China-free supply chain. Because compared to our neighbors, one of the other things that makes
like friend-shoring chips.
Exactly. The one thing that makes us exceptional is that unlike Indonesia and others, our mining sector is not dominated by Chinese, especially when it comes to EV. Right? We're super close to Taiwan, which is a super semiconductor superpower. Right? I come from Baguio, where we have Texas Instrument forever. So we have experience. So one of the arguments is that the Philippines could be part of this new global order, whereby we are part of this friend-shoring on steroids. You look at the works of Robert Lighthizer, the trade representative guru, basically the ideologue of Trumpian trade policy. The idea is that the U.S. should create blocks, and there should be this friendly bloc of like-minded countries who are like not dependent on China, and then we have balanced trade with each other. What do you think should the Philippines' approach should be nowadays? Should it maximize this newfound sense in America that we should work more with countries that are friendly to us and strategic partners, rather than that whole globalization era, just take the money where it's cheapest, never mind you're going to depend on China for practically everything, for your drone and for even military equipment?
So I live in Berkeley, that's where the university is, and on our main street there's a big Tesla store. These days, people are rallying there all the time. But what's interesting is beside that Tesla store is a VinFast store directly beside Tesla. And I took a picture of it, and I showed it to you. And
I visited it
and
myself,
in many ways, we thought, the nerve of these Vietnamese to take them on directly in Main Street, right? But then you told me something like, this should be our nerve as well, right? Yung ganong klaseng kapal ng mukha to compete with them at that level, maybe you fail, right? But the fact is you're putting yourself out there. And just the fact that you put yourself out there, even if you fail, you've created technology transfer, you've created a lot of experts, and that serves as a basis for you to try again. Remember, in industrial policy, there are for every big success in industrial policy, there are, 5, 10 failures, right? So every failure is not just a failure, it's a learning process. And I think in the neoliberals' mind, they want to discount industrial policy and say, this failed, so, move on. But actually, they don't realize that industrial policy is a trial and error process.
The 4 chaebols of Korea were out of 60 when they started working with the park general park regime, right? And then it got
Hyundai. I think its first run was like 100 cars or something ridiculous, right?
And all of them started. LG was like they didn't even want to get into the. So a lot of the chaebols used to be our standard oligarchs doing land grabbing here, exporting low added value. And they were pushed by the regime and eventually by the Korean state. They work with to become this global technological powerhouses. which is why the VinFast is important, right? The guy behind the VinFast used to sell noodles in Ukraine, right? And Russia, and this guy was just worth $1 billion or $2 dollars a year. Why do I say only? Because our oligarchs are worth double-digit billions. Some of our oligarchs go 200 years back. I don't think we need to name names. And what I'm saying, what have you been doing all these years? I was in the Museum of Psycho in Japan the other year, and I was like, Psycho started like just over 100 years ago as a small shop. Next thing, it took on the West within one generation. Like, and I was like, we already had some of our oligarchs that can be dated back to where Psycho. So what went wrong with the oligarchs? Because there was no state support? I mean, why didn't they also level up on their own?
Well, I think there was no state support, but also in terms of the segment of the elite that the government supported, it was a highly import-dependent elite. And and we should really, I think, everybody romanticizes the Garcia administration. I think the Garcia administration is really to blame here, because Filipino First didn't really mean Filipino First. Filipino First meant non-Chinese, because it was a racist policy. Non-Chinese people who are doing a lot of
Filipino importers first.
Filipino importers first. So so we whitewashed the Garcia administration by calling him a nationalist and romanticizing him in our textbooks. And you have great nationalists like Renato Constantino waxing poetic about Filipino First, but it was a racist policy and it was an anti-exporter policy. And until and I'm a historian, until we've rewritten our history to emphasize certain things that led to the failure of developmental policy, I don't think we're going to be able to move on, because we also need to tell new stories.
New stories, new policy discussions, because the Philippines, I think, is at the cusp of transformation on many fronts, a new geopolitical environment, but at the same time, domestically, there are also many things that are coming together. Sabi ko, we had inutil liberalism. We had also very much inutil populism. If you look at it, still the Philippines has not built those global industries as we speak. So maybe down the road, we have to have the proper public policy discussion, because this is it. It shouldn't be a monopoly of any school, any academics. These are issues that are of concern to everyone. It's about jobs, it's about well-being and long-term development. Dr. Claudio, just for the purpose of our viewers, what is the title again of your book, and when can they expect?
It's a bit of a technical title, but it's called The Proflegate Colonial, How the United States Exported Austerity to the Philippines, coming out with Cornell Press in November 2025.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Dr. Claudio. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify and YouTube. I'm Richard Haydarian. That was The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.